Hey guys, Sko here, and in this video we will be looking at tanks for the first BFA raid tier. The start of an expansion is always the hardest time to try and rank the tanks accurately, and this hasn't been made easier, with no level 120 pre-made characters being made available by Blizzard to actually test with. Therefore, I have had pretty limited testing on certain classes. Overall with BFA, we haven't seen a huge amount of class changes though. We have seen some abilities stripped, including a lot of the artifact stuff we had on Legion. However, some of this comes back in via AZEROTH traits on gear, talents, or just through being made baseline for the class. GCD changes for tanks have been big though, and a lot of what we would use on the fly like Bristling Fur and Frenzied Regen for Guardian Druids are now subject to global cooldown, which definitely changes the gameplay and takes a lot of getting used to. Other than that, the way in which tanks now handle magic damage is probably the largest change. All tanks' active mitigation is now aimed towards only physical damage, and abilities that used to handle magic damage like Spell Reflect have either been significantly reduced in power or removed from the game completely. Basically, magic damage has become more scary, and Blizzard will be balancing raids around this. I'm going to change the approach to the tank ranking videos going forward, and try and do a system similar to how Method did the BFA Healers ranked video, link in the description. Meaning, I'm going to put a number on each tank based on certain categories. The first and most important category for rating is still and probably always will be active mitigation, aka physical damage reduction, of which the tanks will be scored out of a maximum of 12 points. When raid tanking, especially on progress raiding, when you're undergeared, you are typically one-on-one with the boss for between 5 to 10 minutes. Consistent damage smoothing is the most important factor to consider. The raid doesn't want the extra stress of random spike damage on a tank when trying to make progress. You want to be taking the same damage each try so as to create a rhythm with the raid group. The second category will be titled Magic. This category will be scored out of 6 points, so half as much of an emphasis as active mitigation, and will include things like tank passive damage reduction, tank health, cooldowns at the tank's disposal, and any abilities that tanks have to reduce incoming magic damage. Thirdly, we will have a category for self-sustain. This is less important in raiding, and so will be scored out of 3 points. The reason it is less important is because self-sustain is a reactive element rather than proactive, with for example having active mitigation up. Reactive is never as good for damage smoothing, however it is still a nice to have for any tank. In raid groups, it's also less important because you typically have 4 to 5 healers who always have the tanks as priority. The final category is utility, and again, this is further lowering in value, to be scored out of a maximum of 1.5 points. Utility is often limited in raids, and almost never the reason you bring a specific tank. However, let's not forget the raid buffs that are coming in BFA, and of course the power of the Guardian Druid Roar, or on specific encounters, Death Knight Grip. Now that the scoring system is out the way, it is important to remember 2 things before we get into the rankings. Firstly, these are my rankings for raiding only. The rankings are different from Mythic Plus, and I do plan to do a quick follow-up video shortly after this one to talk about how I see the ranking there. In that regard, if you enjoy this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel and enable notifications to check when the next one goes live. Secondly, as I stress at the start of every tank ranking video, this is an opinion piece, and it's okay to disagree with the rankings I put out. I always enjoy reading your guys' feedback in the comments down below. That being said, let's jump into the tank rankings for BFA. In position 6, we have Demon Hunter, and here's how I scored it. In terms of active mitigation, I give it a 5 out of 12, and here's why. Demon Spikes has a longer recharge time than before. It's now 20 seconds, rather than the Legion 15 seconds. This combined with Gluttony, the ability that occasionally puts you into metamorphosis when consuming a soul fragment, now being a talent on the same line as Spirit Bomb rather than baseline, is not great for Demon Hunter. Active mitigation has a problem for Demon Hunter and Legion too, but the window in which you transformed into metamorphosis was a welcome break to allow some recharge time on Demon Spikes. I fear Demon Hunter is going to go through windows of being extremely vulnerable while tanking in BFA, even with the talent feed the Demon taken to try and reduce the Demon Spikes recharge time. I'm also not a fan of Demon Hunter Mastery, which increases the armor gain from Demon Spikes. From a raid tanking perspective, the downtime of active mitigation is the main problem rather than the strength of the actual active mitigation. In terms of magic, I've given it 3 out of 6. Demon Hunter has a 10% passive damage reduction through demonic wards, relatively high HP, and an optional choice of Soul Barrier for a proactive option to dealing with magic damage, if it's taken over Last Resort that is. Outside of this, however, there's little Demon Hunter has to mitigate magic, other than Fiery Brand or Metamorphosis. In Power Wards, the main magic damage cooldown from Legion has been removed completely. Self-sustain for Demon Hunter, I've given it 3 out of 3. Demon Hunter does have reliable self-sustain in the form of self-healing through soul fragments and lesser soul fragments, which heal a portion of the damage you have taken over the last 5 seconds. This is great reactive based healing. Frailty from Spirit Bomb that heals when you deal damage is also a good amount of constant healing, although possibly less than it did in Legion. Utility wise, I scored it 0.5 out of 1.5. Demon Hunter actually has great utility in normal out of raid scenarios through sigils, which offer a ton of options like Mass Silence, Grip. However, inside raids, these have very limited use. The main utility a Demon Hunter will bring to a raid these days in BFA, and why it's received some scoring points, is Chaos Brand, which increases magic damage taken by 5% on the target. This, however, can also be brought to the raid by a Havoc Demon Hunter, so its usefulness is dependent on the raid comp. Overall scoring for the Demon Hunter is therefore 11.5. It's a fun tank to play, and design-wise, it's one of the better tanks out there for sure. However, when it comes to progress rating, it once again finds itself at the bottom of the tank ranking. It remains much better suited for Mythic Plus. Moving on to position 5, we have the Warrior, which I'm naturally disappointed about scoring-wise. Active Mitigation for Warrior, I've given it a 7 out of 12. The new block mechanics in BFA are really nice, and block is exceptionally strong. The problem is, as mentioned many times before, the uptime. Shield block has its recharge time increased from 13 to 18 seconds in BFA, which really doesn't help things there, and despite some nice talent options like Into the Fray to increase haste levels substantially, it doesn't fix the problem of gaps in active mitigation uptime. Ignore Pain has also been nerfed, and with it being on GCD and its associated rage cost, it doesn't really suffice as a filler during downtime. Warriors are basically in a situation where they have among the strongest active mitigation in the game, but with gaps in uptime, which isn't ideal for progress rating. In terms of magic scoring, I gave Warriors 4 out of 6. Unlike Demon Hunters, Warriors actually still have Spell Reflect, just that it reduces magic damage by 15% now rather than 50% in Legion. Warriors do have a lot of cooldowns available, however. Demo Shout, which now is a reduced cooldown, Last Stand and Shield Wall are all still present, and Ignore Pain is also decent against magic damage. However, being that way means that Blizzard has currently scaled its value quite low, making it only negate 50% of the incoming damage, with what I mentioned above regarding the rage cost and GCD requirement. To get it up is rather mediocre overall. Self-sustain, I've given Warriors 0 out of 3. Warrior has the least amount of self-sustain out of all the tanks. Victory Rush, which relies on you getting the killing blow on targets, is almost never available inside raids for obvious reasons. To take Impending Victory as a talent for self-healing would be a horrible sacrifice of the other two great talents on the line that offer so much more, which makes it not an option either. Warrior would really benefit from some love in this category. Utility-wise, I have given it a 1 out of 1.5. Utility-wise, Warriors are actually pretty strong. Inspiring Presence is gone, but in its place, Rallying Cry is back, which is great to be able to offer the raid a useful cooldown. In addition to that, Warrior also brings Battle Shout, which provides the raid group with a 10% attack power buff. Again, a DPS Warrior could bring this depending on your raid comp, but it's definitely a nice to have. Overall, I've ranked or scored Warriors a total of 12 points. I do quite enjoy playing Warrior, and last month I made a video talking a bit about the spec overall and its changes, including talents and such, which I can link in the video description below to give you guys a little bit more of my in-depth thoughts on the class. But it is what it is right now, and it's down there at number 5. Moving into position 3 and 4, we actually have a combined position here, guys. We have Death Knights and Paladins, who I have scored the same. So they're sharing spot number 3 and 4. Let's start with Death Knight. Active mitigation wise, I gave it a 6.25 out of 12. Quite specific, but Bone Shield will be up 100% of the time. However, like every tank in BFA, it now only reduces physical damage rather than all damage. And Bone Shield is not as strong as other tanks' active mitigation either, increasing armor by a smaller multiplier of primary stat. Spectral Deflection is no longer available as a talent either to further reduce damage, and that was a staple choice of Death Knights in Legion. That being said, Death Knights do still have their Mastery Blood Shield, which should be considered here too, where just like Legion, a physical absorb shield is present after each death strike. Magic wise, I've scored it 3 out of 6. With Bone Shield only reducing physical damage, Death Knight won't be as good as before in terms of handling magic damage. Rather, it will primarily rely on reactive self-sustain, which we mentioned next, and cooldowns of which it still has plenty of. Anti-Magic Shell, which can be talented down to a 45-second cooldown, is still available, alongside Icebound Fortitude and of course good old Vampiric Blood. Self-sustain, we're giving it a 3 out of 3. As before, Death Knight has a ton of self-sustain through talent options such as Blood Drinker, Consumption, Bloodworms. However, the majority of healing will still be through the powerful Death Strike. I really don't think there's too much else to add here, so let's move on. Utility-wise, I've ranked Death Knight 0.25 out of 1.5. Utility-wise, Death Knight is scored low, and the reason for this is because Grip and Mass Grip only really have specific uses when it comes to raids, and outside of that, Death Knight doesn't bring a whole lot. Grip can either be very powerful or useless depending on the encounter, so hard to score here. If Grip is useful, it can almost be a sole reason to have a Death Knight tank in the raid. Think, for example, Kill Jin Darkness Phase with the Mass Grip on the ads, or think about Agromar for controlling the elementals. It just depends on the encounter. Overall, I've given Death Knight a score of 12.5. Death Knight looks to be weaker for rating than it was at the end of Legion. I've heard some complaints as well about rune regeneration not being as great as it was before either. Looking at the talent tree in BFA, it looks somewhat nerfed towards rating. The talent that reduced the runic power cost of Death Strike when you had over 5 Bone Shield stacks is now in the same talent row as Foul Bulwark, which increases your HP for each stack of Bone Shield. These talents used to be both common picks for rating in the past. In addition, the talent Red Thirst is now in the same talent row as Purgatory. Again, both of these were very common picks for rating. Death Knight is also is then, as a result, somewhat forced into spending talent points on what was previously AP traits or legendary effects from Legion, and you'll quickly notice this if you ever look at the talent tree. I just want to point out at this point that a lot of tanks are actually feeling slower than they were before, and a reason for that I think is because 3 pieces of the gear that you typically equip currently don't have any secondary stats on them. So like the helm, the shoulders, the chest, because they have the AZEROTH traits on them, I believe they're missing secondary stats. So haste levels, I assume, for most tanks are going to be a lot lower, which definitely affects tanks like Death Knight. And of course, it also affects tanks like Paladin, which we're coming on to next. So let's look at Paladin right now. Paladin, I've given it a 7 out of 12 for active mitigation, so very similar to Warrior. Basically, Shield of the Righteous has a longer recharge time than before, 18 seconds now instead of 16 seconds, and now only reduces physical damage by increasing your armor substantially. When it is up, it's a mega strong active mitigation, however, it is when it's not up that we need to be worried about. The new Paladin mastery changes are a welcome addition, providing you with a base passive damage reduction when standing in your consecration and still increasing your block percentage. However, on reviewing the changes a bit closer, the damage reduction component isn't huge, and it's lower than what you would gain from versatility, I believe, point for point. However, the block increase component also needs to be weighed up to determine whether the primary secondary stats for Paladin are going to be haste and versa, or haste and mastery. I guess we'll see in time. The first line of talents for Paladin are pretty interesting, with Holy Shield still increasing your block percentage by 15%. With good gear, you'll probably be sitting around 45% block with Holy Shield talented, which is definitely quite nice. However, it's still not 100% consistent, of course. Alternatively, the new tier 1 talent Redoubt can be picked instead, which increases the amount you block by 75%. This is actually not going to be too far off a Warrior's critical block, which would reduce physical damage quite substantially, but then you would be playing obviously with a lower block percentage overall, which opens up the windows. Magic damage wise, I would say that Paladin is a 4 out of 6, and I do think Paladins are quite decent at handling magic damage. We talked a little bit about Holy Shield above, earlier, and the tier 1 talent, it's a tier 1 talent of course, that still allows Paladins to block magic damage, reducing it by 40%. And I can already see this being quite strong on, for example, G'huun, who in later phases attacks with both a melee attack and a magic attack as plague damage. Alongside this, the passive damage reduction from Mastery is quite nice, which again, it's effectively the Legendary Ring effect from Legion. And on top of that, the usual Paladin cooldowns are available in the form of Adjunct Defender, Guardian of Ancient Kings, Spell Warding, and so on. Self-sustain wise, I gave Paladin a 1 out of 3. Because to be honest, Paladin's self-sustain is not great, especially now that Light handed the Protector on GCD, and they've had their recharge times increase. But nonetheless, it's still useful. Utility-wise, I gave Paladins a 0.5 out of 1.5. Paladins bring decent utility via Spell Warding, immunity via Divine Shield, that can be used to handle obviously certain raid mechanics, and of course blessings that they can provide to the raid. On top of that, there is still the option to use Aegis of Light if talented. Overall, similar to Death Knight, I gave Paladins a scoring of 12.5. And I do think overall Paladins are in a decent position. They do play quite solid, and the playstyle definitely feels pretty smooth from my limited experience. The only thing that really continues to hold Paladins back from the top spot is the downtime on active mitigation, and although I feel like Paladin is still quite sturdy in those windows, I don't think it's quite there yet, and on progress rating won't provide the predictability and full damage smoothing that is truly optimum. Druid. That brings us up to position 2, guys, and we have our good old Legion buddy, the Guardian Druid. Active mitigation for Druids, I've scored a 10 out of 12. And Guardian Druid active mitigation hasn't really changed much. They still have 100% uptime on Iron Fur, and for guaranteed multiple stacks on very high physical damage, Bristling Fur can be used. This makes Guardian Druids continue to be amazing for consistent damage smoothing, and there isn't really much else to add past that. We haven't talked much about AZEROTH traits that each tank has, as I don't really think it drastically changes the playing field in terms of the rankings for raids. However, there is a trait for Guardian Druids that when Iron Fur is used, you gain an agility increase, and also a 10% chance of gaining 2 stacks of Iron Fur instead of 1, which is going to be nice. Magic, I've scored Druids 3 out of 6. Guardian Druid still has a lot of cooldowns to deal with magic damage, and importantly, they should still be the tank with the highest HP through their mastery, which is a pretty huge bonus. In addition, Thick Hide for a 6% passive damage reduction is still present too. And that being said, though, Druid, like every tank, has become weaker to magic damage in some form, and Adaptive Fur, which you used to have on your artifact weapon, is no longer around. Self-sustain, I gave Druids a 1 out of 3. And Frenzied Regen is still Druid's primary self-sustain, however it has been nerfed quite a bit from Legion. It has 1 less charge, a longer recharge time, and it's also been placed on GCD. And more so, the healing for what is probably a lot less than Legion, as it's a fixed amount of percentage of max health now, rather than based on how much damage you took in the last 5 seconds. Utility-wise, I gave Druids a 1 out of 1.5, and even though the talent Guttural Roars is no longer in the game, meaning the cooldown and range of Roar has been nerfed significantly, it's on a 2 minute cooldown now, rather than the 1 minute cooldown before, Roar will continue to be one of the best, if not the best, tank utility spells for raiding. Depending on the encounter, of course, but generally you will always find a use. I've talked about Guardian Druid Roar quite a bit in the previous tank videos, so I don't want to repeat myself again, but it is an incredible raid buff. Overall, I've given Druids a total point score of 15, and Druid remains very strong for raiding. However, unfortunately, it also remains rather dull to play, even more so in BFA. The removal of the artifact ability takes some of the strength and fun out of the class, I feel, and I feel like Blizzard need to add some kind of offensive damage cooldown to the class to make up for it. There's been some overall damage output concerns around Guardian Druid and BFA, and I'm not quite sure where they are at right at this second, but come launch I do trust Blizzard wouldn't leave them too far behind other tanks in that capacity. The advantage with Druid being rather simple to play is that your raid awareness should be extremely high, which is nice of course when progress raiding on the hardest challenges in the game. And in spot number 1, guys, we have the Monk, the Brewmaster Monk. Active mitigation for Monk, I've scored 12 out of 12 because honestly, nothing is better than Stagger for damage smoothing. And with what should be a full uptime on Ivenskin Brew, you should be expecting to take consistent damage that won't throw out any of your surprises. In short, Monk is just a beast for handling incoming physical damage. Magic, I scored at 2 out of 6. The amount of magic damage that Monks can stagger has been reduced in line with other tanks, and Mystic Vitality is not a talent that can be taken to further improve it anymore. But the important part is that it can still be partially staggered, which means it can at least be somewhat smoothed out. In addition, there is the option of the new talent Guard in BFA, which prevents an amount of otherwise staggered damage. Self-sustain wise, I gave it a 1 out of 3. Self-sustain for Monks has been reduced with the new values on Gift of the Ox, making healing spheres heal you for less than before. Utility wise, I gave it a 0.5 out of 1.5. Similar to Demon Hunter, the main value that a monk brings to a raid is the 5% increase to physical damage on the target, called Mystic Touch. Again, this can be brought by other monk specs though, so its usefulness is dependent on your raid comp. In total, I gave monks a 15.5 scoring. Overall, not really much has changed with monk and BFA, and it ended out Legion is one of the strongest tanks, and it will continue to fill that role in BFA raiding. Simply put, Stagger is amazing for overall damage smoothing, and on progress rating, as discussed at the start of this video, that's critical. To conclude, the chart on screen shows you where I believe each tank to be sitting in relation to one another in the current BFA beta patch. For the most part, a few of the tanks are quite close in strength for raiding, but you can see that the top two, Druid and Monk, managed to pull away from the pack. As mentioned at the start of the video, ranking the tanks at the start of an expansion with limited playability on each of the classes and no 120 pre-mades is no easy task, and I'm sure some of you might have a different opinion than I do, which is fine. I'll be doing a separate video to discuss tanks in Mythic Plus because I feel the ranking there is actually very different. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to subscribe and enable notifications to keep up with the channel. I do plan on posting a lot of BFA content going into the expansion, and it would be great to have you guys along for that ride. Anyway, thank you for tuning in, and see you on stream.